Hello, and welcome back to MadMouseGames. When we have an adventure that we want our players to hook onto, it can be difficult sometimes to get the players to bite. Well, that shouldn't be surprising, because just like with a fish, tossing out a hook does no good, unless there's bait on it. So, what's the best way to bait our hook? I have a personal theory that foreshadowing is the best way to bait the players to a hook. Let's break that down. First, let's define what foreshadowing is. A basic definition of foreshadowing is a hint at a future event. And it's a tool used in cinema and stories. There's tons of examples out there, some more obvious than others, but they allow the audience, and not necessarily the characters, to have a small window into the future. There are tons of examples in foreshadowing, but I'll share just one with you. In The Empire Strikes Back, yeah, that's a great movie, Luke is on Dagobah and finds a cave. Inside, he fights and decapitates Darth Vader. After the helmet finishes rolling, it explodes, and it is revealed that the face inside is Luke's face. This is an excellent use of foreshadowing for several things. It hints that a Jedi can be turned to the dark side. It hints that there may be some kind of personal connection between Luke and Darth Vader. And it hints that Luke may one day have to make the choice to not become Darth Vader himself. At the time of viewing this scene, it may seem unimportant, but after watching the big reveal at the end of the movie and the next movie after, it makes you say, oh, that's what that meant. And that is foreshadowing. So why is foreshadowing important? When one goes fishing, they don't simply toss out a hook. It wouldn't attract many fish, and the ones it does attract will most likely not bite it. It's the same with our games. If we are continually tossing out hooks our players are not interacting with, then we can add some bait to interest them. I mean, when the blacksmith asks the players to go save his daughter, you don't want the reason that the players say yes is because they know that is what you, the DM, prepared. And if they don't do it, they won't be getting much of a session, or they do it because they have nothing else to do. Those are bad reasons to go on these little adventures. So how can we bait them? Well, you can always do things like, if you find my daughter, I'll give you a +1 sword and 100 gold pieces. But I think that's a lame way of baiting, and can build an unhealthy expectation with your players that the only quests worth doing are the ones with a promised reward. If you play your cards right with foreshadowing, then when the blacksmith asks the players to save his daughter, they'll be enthusiastic about going out on the quest. Now, let's make an example. Let's say your next adventure involves slaver orcs who are kidnapping people from villages and selling them to other orc tribes. Your players are traveling to a new village. Let's say you're in a gnome kingdom. Just make it easy. How could we foreshadow to our players what is coming? I think the most effective use of foreshadowing comes when we use it multiple times, in different ways, hinting at the same thing. So, while your players are traveling to this new village that the orcs are going to hit to capture some people, they see some strange tracks. There appears to be a bunch of smaller footprints, all walking in the same line across the road. And it's a muddy spot, so the tracks are fairly well preserved. There's also a fewer but larger footprints on either side of these smaller footprints. Maybe your players want to investigate and make a good roll, so they can tell that there's something that's been dragging in the mud next to the smaller footprints that appears to be some kind of like rope or chains. Or maybe the ranger has a favorite enemy that's orcs, and he can tell that the bigger prints are actually from orcs. Whether your players investigate or not, they now have some information, or they've interacted with that bait already. Let's say they don't make it too far with that, and they decide to just head on into town. Well, maybe there's some kind of guard or militia there that immediately starts to question the players and their reasons for coming to town. After the players ask what his problem is or of information about the surrounding area, the guard can tell them that people have been going missing from surrounding villages and nobody knows what is going on. But they're on high alert. Maybe that's why the militia is all together at the entrance to the town. Either way, the players have another small piece of information. Finally, it's time to set the hook. Later that evening, if the players are staying the night, they're awakened by a scream and rush out to find a few orcs dragging a woman away. The players will probably fight them because they haven't fought anything this session and, players are just murdering people sometimes. But after slaying or capturing the orcs, the players can find a map of a small area with a mark that says camp written next to it. At this point, the players should be able to put 2 and 2 together to figure out what's going on, and they should be on your hook. Maybe then the blacksmith says, "My daughter's gone missing. Can you help me out?" Now, you could just skip to the last part there and have the players catch somebody being dragged away, and the players will probably bite. However, they will not be as engaged with the content. Now, the more foreshadowing that you use, the more interested your players will be in that content when it arrives. Now, what if your players decide to follow the first hint and try to track the tracks? Well, great, your players are already engaging with your content. What if they want to help the guard on duty that evening? Great, they're engaging with your content. And that is the goal, after all, isn't it? Another thing you may be thinking, because this is how I thought when I first started DMing, is what if they figure out with my first hint? What if a player says, "Oh, there must be orcs enslaving nearby gnomes"? I would have considered that a failure when I first started DMing. You don't want your players to know exactly what's going on, right? Well, let's challenge that idea for a moment. When you're watching a movie and don't quite know who the bad guy is, but you have a feeling it is a particular character, and it turns out that you're right, do you feel bummed out that you called it? No. You're excited that you figured out who it was. I think that's the same way with our players. If they figure out what is going on, then they will feel like they are awesome when they get it right. And if they're wrong, but it still makes sense, that's important. It still has to make sense. They'll be impressed at the complicated but realistic world you have provided for them. So, how do we start foreshadowing in our games? The biggest thing is we actually have to prep our sessions and adventures. We have to know what the next hook and adventure is so we can add little hints to our current adventure. I think that's the best way. When we prep ahead, we set ourselves up for success. In the end, if we don't prep, we can't foreshadow what's coming because we don't know what's coming. A lot of people, I think, have a tendency to kind of try to fly by the seat of their pants, and I would not recommend that for this exact reason. When we foreshadow, it gives our players information, but it is a good way of giving our players information without telling them that we're giving them information. Another good way of doing it is by pointing out specific information in the midst of a bunch of other information. So for example, my players one time were in the dark forest. There's evil hags in it, basically. And I was trying to foreshadow that it wasn't just one hag, because that's what they thought it was, but it was actually a coven of hags, 3 hags. And I wanted to hint at that, but just subtly. So I had them spend an evening with some merchants that were traveling through. They all decided to stay there for the night and camp because strength in numbers. And so, I tell them that everybody's swapping stories around the fire, blah, 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 blah. I don't really like say any particular stories until I say there's one particular story that makes the neck or the hairs, that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. And it's a story about these 3 sisters who Basically, their family went camping in the woods when they turned 13, and the kids heard some singing that enticed them into the woods. They went over, a bridge and went through a field of deadly nightshade and went to this special tree. And then they arrived at this hut where they were eaten by the evil witch. And it's the story that the parents brought back with them from the forest. So one of the merchants say, I just think that story is something the parents made up and that they took the kids in the woods and killed them themselves because they didn't like them. Because I knew those kids and they were terrible children. Now, this is this is that person's worldview, right? In reality, these three sisters were all born from a hag, basically. How it works in D&D, the hag eats little children, and then a week later, births those children back out, disguised as the original children they ate, basically. So this hag had eaten a set of triplets, brought them back as these triplet sisters. Well, when they turned 13, their hagness came out. And then they went and found their actual mother and created a coven there in the woods, and their mother left them the woods. And ever since, those three sisters have been causing trouble there and being an evil coven hag. So that little story, just pointing it out, saying, you guys are telling all these stories, but there's one that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand out. It tells the players information that their characters would not necessarily have. Their characters have this weird feeling about it, but it tells the players, hey, this is an important story. The characters might have heard, 10 or 15 different stories about the woods, but you as the DM pointing out that one particular story really helps foreshadow what's going to come. So when it's revealed that these are, the triplets hags, the players go, oh my goodness, that's crazy. I think that's really what we want to go for, is giving them little bits of information without telling them we're giving them little bits of information. It's a hint at a future thing, something that's going to happen. The other thing is the story tells of 3 different locations that are actually on the way to the hag's hut that the players will find. So when they come across this old rickety bridge and then this field full of deadly nightshade, they start going, wait a second. Sounds familiar. Where have we heard this before? Something's going on here. That kind of thing really elevates the story of the game. Now, D&D is, after all, a storytelling RPG, collaborative storytelling. We as the DMs don't want to do the entire story because there's absolutely no fun in that. Some people still do it. I don't think it's fun. I think that would be boring as heck. I think the funnest thing is when your players do crazy things that you're like, how am I going to handle this? Which is a story or a topic for another discussion or another video, is how to better improvise and put up with our players ruining everything. So D&D is a collaborative storytelling game, which means there has to be some kind of story, some kind of plot that plays out. And foreshadowing is a major, major part of any storytelling. Well, any good storytelling, I should say. Some bad storytelling has no foreshadowing. However, good storytelling has good foreshadowing that help when the climax comes about, the climax of the story, the climax of the adventure, when they're fighting the big bad evil guy, or they find the coven of hags, or whatever the case may be. When they get to that climax, they should be able to go, oh my goodness, that's what all that stuff meant earlier. And it helps your players think that everything is much more well put together than it might actually be. That's very helpful. So, foreshadowing is not a hard concept, but it can be hard to implement. Again, the first step, prep, 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 prep. If you know what's coming, you can help tell that to your players. You can help them to see what's coming. Or when things start coming, they go, hey, I think we've heard about this before. Where have we heard about this before? Let us go back and think about it for a minute. Those little things will help improve your game drastically. It's amazing what can happen when we add just a little bit of foreshadowing to our games, or sometimes just bucket loads of it, just throw it on there. Yeah, sometimes people pick up on things like that, and sometimes people don't, which is fine. Having it there will help your game immensely, though. I'll give one final example from my own game. In the campaign I'm currently running, my players have just finished their first downtime activities, and one of the players was in the Underdark and saw an entire city being overrun by undead. Now, this is not a problem the players can deal with at the moment, because they're not high enough level, but it starts to set the stage. Eventually, I plan on the BBEG being a lich who's building an entire undead army to take over the material plane. Don't want to say too much more about it in case they end up watching this, but it goes to show you don't need to have everything planned before you start foreshadowing it. Even if you just have a basic idea for the future, you can hint at it. Baiting our hook is how we get our players to engage with our content. Whether they bite early or when you expect, or even later than you would expect, because sometimes players are a little slow to pick up on that stuff, which is fine. But putting the bait out there will eventually get a bite and will help your players to, one, know that you have a really prepared for your games, and two, will give them a good feeling about accomplishing the quests you put in front of them. And that's it. Hopefully this helped, and if it did, hit that like button so I know that it helped. If this is something that you do in your games, let me know if you have any tips or tricks for foreshadowing as well. And if you want to see more content, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and have a wonderful day.